The Resident Evil remakes have been a very contentious topic. Some people love the modern twist on the classics, and others still prefer the original versions. To this day, there have been remakes of the first 4 numbered games, with one for Code Veronica on the way, so I went back and replayed Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and 4, and their remakes to see which ones are better, what they do differently, and how they compare overall. So for the original Resident Evil, we gotta talk about tank controls and fixed cameras first, because I don't think you can talk about how this game and the next 2 OG games we'll talk about actually play without dealing with them. So being honest, I don't love them. I don't think they make the game unplayable, far from it, but I want to be upfront that my preference is just the smoother over-the-shoulder controls. And I'll be honest about something else too while we're here, since it's gonna come up for the next 2 games as well. The graphics just don't do it for me. To be fair, the pre-rendered backgrounds were a big deal in 1996, and I could look at it and appreciate what they pulled off on that hardware, but I didn't grow up with this look, and that probably affects my view on it. Again, none of that makes this bad, but I just feel like it makes this game a lot less scary, because I mean, look at this. So anyway, going back to the gameplay, you do get used to the controls themselves. The disorientation from the fixed camera stops catching you off guard. After a few rooms, it just starts being the pace of the game. It's very slow and methodical instead of jarring, but getting used to it isn't the same as liking it and even comfortable with it. I still don't love it, like I said, especially once you're actually in a fight. The combat here is stop, aim, and pray, honestly. You can't move and shoot at the same time. There's no dodge, nothing extra in the toolkit beyond pointing a gun and hoping the angle's right. For someone who wasn't raised on this, I don't think the combat in this game is particularly enjoyable. So playing this now, the fixed camera and the tank controls don't feel like 2 separate problems to me. They kind of feel like one thing split into 2 systems. The camera cuts to a new angle every time you walk through a doorway, so your character's orientation on screen resets constantly. And I just gotta say, these doors take forever to open. But anyway, tank controls also steer relative to where your character's facing instead of where the camera's pointed. So every cut is a tiny moment where you have to recalibrate what forward even means. A lot of people say that it's atmosphere, but sometimes it's just standing in a hallway, pressing a direction, and watching yourself walk into a wall. But you could also say that exact disorientation is exactly what sets up its first real scare. You walk into a hallway, nothing has happened yet, the pacing's been slow and quiet on purpose up to that point, and then the game shocks you. And it works because the camera had already taught you not to trust your own sense of direction, and it used that. And right next to all of that real tension sits some of the funniest voice acting ever put into a horror game.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
So, looking at this game objectively, yeah, the voice acting is horrible. I don't think anyone would actually argue it, but just in terms of a novelty of going back to play this now, I would be lying if I said I didn't find it funny. But now let's get into the inventory. And this actually stressed me out more than pretty much any monster in this game. The inventory is brutally small. Jill gets 8 slots, Chris gets 6, and that's everything. Your weapon, your ammo, your healing items, your key items, all fighting for the same tiny pool of space. Chris is the one who pays for it because he has to physically carry small keys to unlock doors, while Jill can open it with a lockpick that doesn't even cost her a slot. So a chunk of his inventory is permanently eaten up just on access before you've thought about survival at all. Jill's whole run is definitely built to be the easier one, and in all transparency, while I've played both campaigns before, for the sake of this replay, I did play as Jill. Like, Barry shows up to bail her out of specific death traps like 3 separate times. She gets the grenade launcher early, and the lockpick alone saves her a chunk of inventory space Chris never gets back. Chris doesn't even get a unique item to make up for it. No defense tools exist in this version of the game at all for either of them. Like, that is a remake edition we'll get into. Here, if you get grabbed, it just means you're just taking damage. But anyway, what Chris gets instead is more health to survive that damage, and Rebecca, who only helps him through one small optional stretch of the game, compared to how often it seems Barry bails Jill out. Picking a character on the start screen is picking a difficulty curve whether you realize it or not. The inventory squeeze isn't even the worst of it. Ink ribbons take that same scarcity and make it more like psychological instead of more logistical, if that makes sense. You need a typewriter and a ribbon to save, and ribbons are a limited resource you find scattered through the mansion, same as ammo or herbs. You catch yourself standing in save rooms actually debating whether you've earned a save or not, whether what you just survived was risky enough to justify spending one of the 4 ribbons you have left. The monsters barely factor into that fear, it's just about how cautious it makes you feel about your own progress. Losing unsaved progress to a hunter that one-shots you from around a blind corner hits completely differently when you're the one who chose not to save. And I'm gonna be honest, it happened a few times during my playthrough, and it did make it pretty frustrating to finish this game. But at the same time, the scarcity isn't accidental. Mikami has said outright that Capcom deliberately made the American version harder than the Japanese one, specifically at the request of the US staff, because they were worried people would just rent the game and beat it over a weekend without buying it. So there's fewer ink ribbons, no auto aim, the whole thing just tuned up on purpose so a rental wouldn't be enough time. This actually came back in Resident Evil Requiem, but I did not use it. I just do not have the patience for it if I have the option to just save whenever I want. And if you're good enough at the game, if you have the mental fortitude to get past that, good on you. And against all that scarcity, the herb system is the one place you get some leverage back. Green alone heals a little, 2 greens heal more, and that's an insane amount of inventory space to dedicate it to 1 heal. The smart play is using green plus red, since red does nothing but double whatever it's mixed with. So that combo fully heals you in a single slot. Add blue and you get a full heal that also cures poison. Nobody tells you this directly, you either find a note or just work it out yourself. And working that out on your own instead of reading it somewhere is super satisfying. When I first played this game, I actually discovered that on my own. I did know how the green herbs worked playing other Resident Evil games, but I wasn't sure how the blue herbs worked here. So regardless of what you think of this game, it is very, very important historically, and it kicked off the storyline that's been retconned like a million times in the past 30 years. So here we have Chris and Jill, who are members of STARS. They get sent into the Arklay Mountains to investigate a string of murders, lose their helicopter pilot, and then end up getting stuck in the Spencer Mansion. The whole game is basically you solving the mansion one room at a time. There's plenty of notes and stuff you could find to give you some more context on the story. And again, this is something that would come back in literally every other Resident Evil game to follow. So on a replay, you're really not paying attention to the story as much. And this isn't the most complex story in the series, but it kind of gave us a good base for the series. Like, it introduced some of the most important characters like Chris, Jill, Wesker, and it's not really in your face for most of it. A lot of the story is kind of just finding notes. Like, this isn't a super cinematic game. Yeah, there's cutscenes, but it's not as common as like the more modern Resident Evil games. So a lot of issues in this game are kind of subjective. Things like being limited by the ink ribbons can definitely be annoying, although it's a very intentional decision. The tank controls and fixed cameras, I wouldn't call issues, I would call it a design choice, but still perfectly fine if you have a different preference. And then for the difficulty, this is a difficult game. A lot of the difficulty also is just having to replay different sections and maybe playing a different way because you're scared. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of that, I can say it does add to the survival horror. And the enemies here are just complete bullet sponges, and there's really not much you can do a lot of the time. A lot of times you're just going to have to run past them. But before I give more of my overall thoughts on this game, let's talk about the remake. So unlike every other remake on this list, this one actually is supposed to be faithful, and it very much is, but faithful doesn't mean static. Capcom rebuilt the mansion with a visual overhaul that still looks pretty good today. Running past a threat stops being a desperate last resort and is actually a real choice here. Which sounds small until I'm standing in a hallway actually deciding whether I should stay or should I go. They hand you that control and then immediately start finding new ways to take it away again. And I think Crimson Heads are the best proof of that. If you leave a zombie corpse without burning it using a lighter and kerosene, which takes inventory space or taking its head off, they get back up faster, hit harder, and come for you with more purpose. Every time you kill a zombie, or think you kill a zombie I should say, you now have to think about what you're going to do. Are you going to gamble and say, you know what, I'm not coming back through this hallway, I'm not going to need to waste anything on this, but maybe you have to come back, maybe you forgot something. So while you have a little more agency here on how to get past enemies, it's not like it just makes the game easier because it adds in the Crimson Head system. And to be honest, I like this system better. This game also adds Lisa Trevor, who kind of pushes that idea farther than anything else in the mansion. Guns barely slow her down, so chase sequences are barely even fights. And you could actually avoid killing her outright in the final encounter. And the only reason I bring this up is because it's just extra content that was added in the remake that I feel builds upon the original game. Also, let me just add, the original never gave you a way out of a grab at all. Like I said, you just had to eat the damage and keep moving. But here you can mash a button to break free instantly. You have a dagger for both of them, or whichever special defensive item your character is carrying. So Jill's stun gun or Chris's flash grenade. So even getting caught becomes a spend it or save it decision instead of just knowing you're going to take damage. So I don't want to just repeat everything since this game is very, very similar to the original. But the one other thing I want to add is the caves here are where this starts to drag. It's a stretch of mostly new content that trades the mansion's tight, readable layout for just repetitive corridors with thinner enemy variety, and just the kind of slow crawling that defined this genre early on, instead of being one tool among several. This isn't an entirely new area, but it's expanded here, and it really didn't need to be, if I'm being honest. However, really besides that, I think that's the only negative I can think of compared to the original. I'm always hesitant to say a remake replaces the original, like most of the time they're different enough that they're both two separate games, but this is one of the rare remakes where I would just call this the default recommendation outright. Now, I'm not saying never play the original. I think if you're interested historically, or if you just become a big Resident Evil fan and just want to play every game, then it's still worth going back to. But you can play this and just basically get a better experience than the original. I know people are going to hate that in the comments. Someone's going to say, well, no, it doesn't replace the original. That's just my take on it from these replays. Going back to this after the original, I definitely felt a lot less stressed just because it's so similar that I pretty much knew where to go, like what items I needed, where I needed to find them, the different puzzles. So comparing these games is a lot more straightforward than the next three duos we're going to talk about because you can pretty much put them next to each other. So this is going to be an easy win for Resident Evil Remake. And now it's going to get a little more complicated for the rest of this video. Now, if you're enjoying this video so far and you want to help me reach 15,000 subscribers and see more Resident Evil videos like this, be sure to subscribe. So I went into the original RE2 after already loving the remake, which is backwards from how most people experience this. And I was actually surprised because it doesn't play like a warm-up act for the version I already knew. It's like its own thing. So it's the same deal as RE1 with the graphics. Like, I'm not going to make it its whole thing again. Yes, it has PS1 graphics. Yes, it has tank controls. Yes, it has fixed cameras. So I don't think we need to repeat that. So of course, like with the remake, you have Leon and Claire here. I played as Leon for the sake of this video, but to get the full experience of this, you really need to play it multiple times. For example, you could clear a hallway as Leon, no problem, move on and forget about it. Then play Claire's same side of the story, that exact hallway, and that exact hallway has zombies in it that weren't there before, because of something I did or didn't do hours earlier as a completely different character. So that's the zapping system, and it's the reason this is one original game on this list where I'd actually tell you to play both sides instead of picking one and watching a recap of the other. It came out of Capcom basically starting over. The first version of the game, the one's now called RE 1.5, was already about 70% finished before a newly hired screenwriter said it didn't feel like Resident Evil and they scrapped it. So this concept makes this game very replayable. Like, you can basically play through it 4 times and have a different experience each time. And then there's even more differences. Like, for example, Mr. X only shows up at all if you're on the B side of this game, which means there's 2 halves of the story that really do feel like they're hiding things from each other. I'll talk about this more with the remake, but this is one of the most disappointing things that was not in the remake. Anyway, when you walk into the main hall of the police station for the first time, it's easy to think you wandered into the wrong building. Like, nothing about a giant clock statue and a hidden owl puzzle says police station to me. That's kind of the point. This place makes way more sense as a video game level than an actual precinct, and that makes sense considering a regular police station would probably be a pretty boring location. So like with the original Resident Evil, a lot of the game takes place in one location, although there are more locations after. So the RPD is one of, if not the best location in survival horror. It's fun to navigate, there's so many hidden secrets, and it feels like the building is alive. Like, everything just seems to connect, sort of like the Spencer Mansion. And I know I've brought up that example a couple times, but I think it just bears repeating. So you have your standard zombies here, but then you also have lickers, which are a completely different kind of scary thing. And they're even scarier in the original, not because of the graphics, because obviously the graphics are a lot worse, but just the fact that there's really not much you can do. If they charge you, if they know where you are, you just have to just shoot and pray. Now, does that make the game better? That just comes down to personal preference, but I would say it definitely makes it more stressful compared to the remake when a licker comes after you, where it's easier to defend yourself, where it's easier to run away. So I did just want to bring that up. I also want to say that the combat in Resident Evil 2, it's very similar to the original, but there's a little more variety here. The game's a little more cinematic, there's more enemy variety, but the part that held us back for me was just the real amount of backtracking through the same handful of RPD hallways, like, isn't as streamlined here. Like, I felt like it was a little better in the remake. And then after this game leaves the RPD, it really goes downhill, but we can say the same thing for the remake, which I'm gonna get into here. So when this came out in 2019, it was the first vastly different remake in the series. The previous remake came out 2 generations ago at that point, and like I said, it was a very faithful remake. Resident Evil 2, though, really changed things up. So we do have to talk about the zapping system. Like I mentioned, it's gone here. In its place is something called first run and second run, and while it's somewhat close, it's just not the same thing. Like, Mr. X used to only show up on the B side of the original. Here he's a threat both times. Like, the remake clearly prioritizes a cleaner, more streamlined campaign over the original's messier, branching structure. And honestly, I don't think removing it is the worst thing ever. I think it's disappointing, but I could live without it. It also trimmed a handful of enemies that existed before, like crows, spiders, giant moth, tougher licker variants. There was no explanation given. I'd assume some would probably just make this game feel a little more grounded. And Mr. X was in the original game, but he is completely different here. Instead of just waiting for scripted triggers, he goes around the map just looking for you. Like, you'll hear his footsteps, and sometimes he'll just get in your way when you try to do a puzzle or something. I really like this addition. Like, you could say that having better movement in this game and having better combat makes the game easier, makes it so it's less scary, but I think Mr. X does a really good job to kind of counter that. And going back to what I just said, of course this game has a third-person over-the-shoulder camera, it has 360-degree movement, there's no tank controls here, so the game changes around that. And while it doesn't try to be one-to-one, it's kind of its own thing. A lot of the original game did survive intact here. You have Kendo's gun shop where it's supposed to be, you have the general shape of the RPD, you have the clock tower puzzle, the layout of the main hall. It's all recognizable, just wearing a different coat of paint, which is why I think there was such high praise of this game. Now, you'll have people who disagree with this. You will have people who say that it loses what the original Resident Evil 2 was trying to be, like with the zapping system, changing up Mr. X, like removing some enemies, but I gotta say, I like the remake better. I don't think it replaces the original. I think they are both worth playing. I think whether you are a new school Resident Evil fan or an old school fan, I think both of these games are definitely worth playing. It's obviously a lot easier to get into the remake, but if you like the remake and you're willing to try out the tank controls and fixed cameras of the original, you're gonna get a very different experience. You're gonna get a slower, more methodical game compared to the remake, which is just a modern take on that. So there's people who went into this knowing they would hate it just because it's not the original, and I think a lot of the criticisms come down to nostalgia nostalgia. However, for the next game we're going to talk about, I think there's a lot more valid criticisms for the remake. Resident Evil 3 feels smaller than RE2 in some ways, and more aggressive in almost every minute of it. Graphics-wise, it's the same, very similar controls. It's not the most original of the original Resident Evil games, and I get why some people call it more of an expansion than a full sequel. But the thing it has that the remake never fully gets back is just the panic here. Like, this is the one entry in the original trilogy that keeps pushing you forward before you're ready for it. And I'll get to what I mean in a minute. So before that, I want to talk about the dodge mechanic, which I like the concept of, at least on paper. If you time a dodge right, then you avoid damage and can fire back at full advantage. So combat against regular enemies is supposed to stop being just stand still and shoot the entire time. However, I never felt like I had that timing under control. Like, I feel like dodges in the original Resident Evil 3 just kind of felt like luck. And every time I actually did get it, it felt like it was just completely random. But anyway, of course the big thing here is Nemesis. And he's very different to Mr. X in the original RE2. He's just a lot less contained. Like, he can chase you between areas and force live selection decisions instead of just waiting in a boss room for his turn. You'd hear him before you see him too, and he would just cut through whatever else is happening on screen. Several times through the game, Nemesis corners you and forces a real-time choice. Fight him or take the live selection prompt to run, and those choices aren't huge decisions, but they do matter. Not gonna lie, when I was playing this, I mostly just chose to run. He keeps changing on you too, which is probably the part that gets under your skin the most. He starts as just a hulking but fairly conventional pursuer in that coat, then loses it for something more monstrous, and by the end he can launch attacks at range, so the late fights against him don't feel like the early ones, even though it's technically the same boss the entire way through. The pacing of the whole game reflects all of that. This is a noticeably tighter, more action-focused experience than RE2. It's fewer of the slow, methodical puzzle stretches and more sequences built around keeping you moving while something's actively hunting you. It tracks with where the series was heading right before it pivoted hard into the full action game RE4 became a few years later. The action focus also shows up in the weapon system too. Since this is the first game in the series to let you actually build your own ammo instead of just finding it, it just gives you more agency with your ammo management. It's a small system, but it fits this game where it's just constantly having you decide between fighting and running. Now for the city itself, it really breaks from how the first two games were built. You're out on actual streets, alleys, a park, a factory district. It's just a more open, sprawling feeling than the contained mansion or police station of the previous two games, even if it's still fundamentally linear once you look closely. Jill, a former STARS member, is just trying to get out of a city that's already gone by the time the game starts. Remember, this starts the day before Resident Evil 2 and overlaps with it, and eventually runs past it, and I always just really love this concept. And also, things get interesting later on when you actually play as Carlos instead of Jill. And for those of you who have only played the remake, this is a lot different here. Carlos gets a much smaller part of the game, where in the remake, definitely gets him more involved, but here it's really just the section in the hospital. I gotta say that I actually really like the back half of this game, maybe even more than the first half, which for Resident Evil usually doesn't happen. Like, look at almost every Resident Evil game, and it usually starts in a great area and then starts to get worse. But I really like what Resident Evil 3 progresses into. It gets over the top with the missile strike happening and everything, and then the final fight with Nemesis is awesome. I also want to say, while it's not part of the main campaign, but Mercenaries got its start here too. There's 3 mercenaries, each with their own loadout and a hard timer, and you race a condensed version of the city and grab trapped civilians to make extra seconds before the clock runs out. I think it's funny to think about now, considering how big that mode eventually got across the rest of the series. But here it's stripped down and arcade-like. It was more like an idea they were testing here, and then it really progressed in future games. The common knock on this game, going back to when it released, is that it plays more like an expansion pack than a real sequel, like I mentioned. A lot of the city reuses areas and assets straight out of RE2, and even people who like it will admit it's shorter and more action-heavy than either of the first 2 games. But ask those people which stalker they found scarier, original Nemesis or original Mr. X, and you're almost always going to hear Nemesis. I really like the original RE3, and as someone who prefers the more modern games, I actually found this very enjoyable. So yes, you're going to have the same issues with the graphics or the tank controls and fixed cameras if you don't like that, and just the quirks of games at the time, but if you can get past all of that, this is still a really fun game. Where do I even start with the Resident Evil 3 remake? This game gets a lot of hate, so I'm going to start with the positive. The combat actually feels great here. The dodge is tighter and more readable than the originals. Like, it actually feels good to dodge and attack, and feels like you could actually learn the timing of it. Carlos throwing his own counterattack punch instead of dodging also makes him feel like a different character in a fight, and the opening alone shows what this remake could have been. Jill's apartment building is rebuilt in gorgeous detail, and their whole redesigned opening sequence is great. Of course, being on the PS4 compared to the PS1, it's more cinematic, it feels more desperate, but it's overall actually a great opening. And I don't think a lot of people have issues with the combat or the dodge mechanic or how this game looks. The big thing here is how the game was redesigned and the content that was missing. So one thing people always point to is the clock tower being missing. So pretty much every remake cuts something, and that's not automatically a problem, because sometimes the game replaces something that wasn't good, or just changes it, or just replaces it with something. But this is one of the most memorable moments moments in the original game, and that's just used as background scenery for a boss fight. Like, you don't actually go inside the clock tower here, you just fight Nemesis in the courtyard out front while the building sits there. The dead factory's gone entirely, it's replaced with a lab called Nest 2, that's basically running the RT ending back at me. Same corridor, same aesthetic, same beats I'd already seen a year earlier in a different game. The graveyard's gone, so the Gravedigger boss goes with it. Live selection, the entire reason the original had 4+ different paths through certain sequences, is just completely gone. Every choice point now just funnels into one fixed road. Even Mercenaries got pulled out of the campaign and just bolted onto Resistance, which was a separate multiplayer game almost no one asked to buy. Whatever the actual reason, and the producer has said that this was a 3-year project and a finished product the team stands by, not a rush one. The sections that needed the most work are the ones that didn't get it, and that's true regardless of why. So I try not to write off cut content immediately, because a lot of times it does get swapped for something just as good. And a remake was never required to be a 1-to-1 copy, but it's just not even close here. Carlos's hospital section actually grew instead of shrinking. It's longer, it's better paced, gives him a couple of standout moments that are his alone. Navigating the hospital I actually don't hate. I don't love this section, but I don't think it's bad. Honestly, it's probably one of the stronger stretches in the whole game. But that single expansion doesn't come close to covering for everything trimmed around it. Nemesis goes from someone who could show up almost anywhere in the city to someone the game schedules for you through scripted chases and staged fights. Like, he plays out more like Mr. X in the original Resident Evil 2. And oddly enough, Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake plays more like the original Nemesis. Now, like I've said, this game doesn't have to be a 1-to-1 recreation. That's not what I want. But I feel like changing one of the most fundamental things about this game so drastically just didn't make a lot of sense here. And then Jill plays like a different person too. Like, it feels like she's more reactive, less of the hardened, resourceful survivor 2 prior games built her into. And the whole campaign is short enough to finish in one sitting without trying, which stings worse specifically because the game you kept getting compared to released a year earlier and gave you almost the full treatment of the original game. Like, yeah, there's cuts in the Resident Evil 2 remake, but not as substantial as here. I think the best part of the remake is downtown Raccoon City. Despite everything else, there's environmental storytelling scattered across it everywhere you look. I actually really love the designs here. And part of this kind of makes me sad because you can feel how great of a remake this could have been. You can see some areas of this game. You can see the remake that came out a year before this and how great that was. And then you have this. Like, I really want to like this game because I love the modern Resident Evil games. And I certainly don't hate it. I think it's a fun enough game to play through on its own. But I just think when you're comparing it directly to the original, it just loses a lot. With all that being said, I think this is a decent game. I think it's worth playing, especially since you could get this for like under $10 now. Like, yeah, you're probably going to beat this game in like 3 or 4 hours. But if you're trying to get into the Resident Evil series, I would still say there's a good chance you're going to have a good time here, but also give the original a chance. And as you can probably tell, for the first time in this video, I'm going to choose the original over the remake here. Now for Resident Evil 4, I'm on record saying this one's my favorite. Like, I like the first 3 games, but I would be lying if I said that they weren't a little rough for me to go back to. I don't feel that way with 4 though. The village is survival horror sliding into action. The castle turns the whole thing into a haunted funhouse. Also has some of my favorite lines in any video game ever made.
No thanks, bro.
Then there's the island that leans hardest into pure action, which is honestly my least favorite part of the game, and I actually made a video going over the worst area in every Resident Evil game if you want to check that out. Anyway, I think the camera's a good place to start here. This game dropped the fixed angles, and I really like that it did that. Now, there are still tank controls, but it doesn't really bother me here, and I feel like that really showed me that it's not so much the tank controls I dislike, but I just prefer the more over-the-shoulder view compared to the fixed cameras. Just makes the game feel a lot more fluid. The combat here is just worlds better than the first 3 games. Like, yeah, it's still a little clunky today, but it just feels so much better. And the characters actually look more human here instead of the ancient PS1 designs. Anyway, let me get to the opening moments here, because it has one of the best openings in Resident Evil in my opinion. Within the first few minutes, Leon gets surrounded in a house with seemingly evil villagers trying to attack him. Then you walk into village, and this game really shows how much more of an action game is. And then the church bell rings mid-fight, and every single enemy just stops and walks away to bingo.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I also love the merchant in this game. He's never explained, and I think the only other time he's mentioned in the series is Resident Evil 8, but it kind of just adds to this game's mystique. And anyway, going back to the merchant, you're going to have a lot more supplies in this than the previous games in the series, so it utilizes a different type of case, where you can play more Tetris to try and fit things. This is definitely my favorite inventory style for the entire series. Now, this game changes things up, where instead of just fighting zombies, you're fighting infected villagers and a cult called Los Illuminados. Sadler is the one running it, but he's got separate lieutenants doing the actual work. You got Mendez, who acts as like the village chief. You have Salazar, whose right hand comes off. You have Krauser, that's someone from Leon's own past turned traitor. And they're all just great here in the original. They're all over the top and they're all kind of goofy, but I love that for this game. Also, something very different here is you're escorting Ashley for most of the game. Now she's just going to be screaming, and her AI isn't perfect here, but I never really had that many issues with her like other people did. I do have some issues with this game though. There's plenty of QTEs because it was the mid-2000s. Like almost every major set piece has it, whether it's the boulder chase, several boss fight finishers, the knife fight against Krauser. Like those haven't particularly aged well. But there's a reason this is one of my favorite games of all time. The environments, the characters, just the entire vibe of the game. A lot of it's just hard to put into words if you haven't played this. I actually first replayed this about 5 years ago and just fell in love with it. And on this replay, there was a lot of things that I missed, a lot of things that I forgot were in the original compared to the remake, which I'd played more recently. Like Leon's one-liners alone just instantly improved this game for me. I also think this game is incredibly well paced. Like, yeah, the island is where I think it starts to drag a little bit. I don't really love how over the top action compared to just more survival horror in the first 2/3. So I can't say I had the most fun with that part. But besides that, I felt like there was no part where I was just like, okay, like I just want to move on now. It's also really fun to try and find all the treasures here and to try to get as many pesetas as you can. This is a game I can recommend to a lot of people, even if you've only played the modern Resident Evil games and you might be thrown off by the PS1 games. Resident Evil 4 is literally on like every single console released in the past 25 years. So I think you gotta give this game a shot if you haven't. And now finally, we get to the Resident Evil 4 remake. After the gut punch of the RE3 remake, I wasn't sure how this was going to turn out. In fact, I didn't even play it for a couple years after it came out. I had already played Resident Evil 4, and I was kind of scared to go into the remake and see if a lot of the things I love were removed, kind of like how RE3 removed a lot of the things from the original. I also just wasn't playing video games as much during this time since I was busy with college. But anyway, I'm really glad I gave the remake a chance. One of the first things you'll notice here is the parry mechanic. If you time a knife block right against an incoming attack, then you'll be able to like push them back and not take damage. It's far more readable and satisfying than just backing off and shooting. And the fact that it costs knife durability means that you still have to manage this. Like you can't just use this for every single encounter in the game. The QTEs are pretty much gone here, and it kind of feels like the parry mechanic replaced that in a way. And I absolutely thought that was the right call. Another thing you'll notice is that this game takes itself a lot more seriously. Like the boulder chase is gone, the laser hallway is gone, a bunch of the things in the castle are gone, and it doesn't feel like they're just being lazy cutting content. It just feels like they're going for a much more serious vibe. Now, is that a good thing? Yes and no. I think if you're getting into the series and haven't played the original Resident Evil 4 yet, it might make you take the story a little more seriously. But if you're like me and you love the campiness of the original Resident Evil 4, there are definitely things that I missed. And one of the biggest things I missed isn't even gameplay or location. It's just Leon's one-liners. Yes, he has a lot of one-liners here, and some of them are pretty funny, but it just doesn't compare to the original. I'm just at least glad we got a couple lines back. Another thing added here is crouching and being able to be a little stealthier. The original Resident Evil 4 is not exactly a stealth game. I wouldn't call Resident Evil 4 Remake a stealth game either, but it definitely does give you that option if you want. I used it a little bit, but usually not for more than like a couple enemies at a time. Another thing the game added was more side quests, and I just didn't really care to do a lot of them. Like the blue flyers and stuff, it feels just like busy work, and you don't really need to do it unless you're trying to 100% the game. So that's something I just kind of ignored. I think the biggest win in the remake though is just how Ashley works. Like her AI here is just better. Like it feels like she's running into enemies less, and I'm sure there's gonna be someone who disagrees with me and says that it's worse, but that was just my experience. So overall, this game adds a lot of stuff. Like it also expands on some sections like the lake, and some of the things it removed, like with the boulder chase, like with the laser hallway, like with the giant Salazar statue. That doesn't feel like they removed just to cut content, and it feels like it was meaningfully replaced throughout the game. I don't know if I'd necessarily call that a win, but there are definitely some things that just really don't do it for me in this game. Salazar's design specifically bothers me a lot for some reason. Like the original version is just this exaggerated like gremlin looking kid that Leon mocks for looking like an old man despite his actual age. The new version of him just looks so weird, like just look at these side by side. And while I talked about this game having a more serious tone, I also just kind of miss the original. Like I kind of miss like the B-movie campiness vibes of it. And I know I've mentioned that before, but that is a big thing for me. There's also paid DLC here, which is called Separate Ways. And it's a much bigger expansion of Ada's side of the story than the original's bonus mode ever was. Now Ada's voice acting here is bad. Like for the most part, I think Resident Evil games have had great voice acting in the modern era, with a few exceptions, and Ada's voice acting is definitely one of the exceptions. Overall though, I would say my replay of Resident Evil 4 Remake was still a ton of fun, and it really keeps the charm of the original Resident Evil 4 in a lot of ways, but just changing it. I think this is the hardest call in the entire list for me, because the original has the better personality, it's funnier, it's weirder, it just feels more like itself. The remake has the better combat and the more consistent story, and they're almost dead even for me, and it's hard for me to pick a clear winner. I think if you want a more serious game, if you want the more modern gameplay, if you want more options, go with the remake. But if you like the campiness, the absurdity, and the less complex gameplay, I think the OG is better in that way. I was expecting to get an answer of which game I like better on the replays, but I just really couldn't, honestly. So replaying all of these over the past of a couple months, the actual pattern surprised me. How much a remake changes has nothing to do with whether it works. The RE1 remake changes almost everything about how the mansion looks, and barely touches what made it scary in the first place. And it's the only entry on this list that replaces the original outright, at least for me. I'm sure there's people who disagree. RE4 remake changes the camera, the combat, half the cast personalities a little little bit, and somehow still feels great along with the original. RE3 Remake might look less radical on paper, but it just loses more of what I actually cared about than either of them. Overall, how would I compare these remakes? So for my personal opinion, 2 of the remakes are better than the originals. One of the OGs is better with Resident Evil 3, and for Resident Evil 4, it's pretty much dead even. But regardless, there's no correct answer here. I think a problem with the Resident Evil community is that they act like there is a definitive answer. You have a lot of people, usually younger people, acting like the remakes are automatically better and that the originals aren't worth playing. And then you have older fans who act like the remakes are a disgrace and you must play the originals and prefer those. I think both of those are flawed. I think for the most part, these are all great games worth experiencing. And I think if you're an OG fan, maybe give the remakes a try if you haven't, just to get a different version of this game. And if you've only played the remakes, and play the originals to see how they hold up. Because even though it may look clunky, a lot of these games are very different. And if you're a big Resident Evil fan, I think you'll find something to love here. And that's just my take on this. I know people are going to disagree. I know people are going to hate me if I disagreed with them on something. And that's just my take on these. You don't have to agree, but I want to know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts on these games and why you think one or the other is better. Now be sure to subscribe, check out these other videos, and join my Discord, and I'll see you next time.